All right, welcome to the next lecture in our science series. Really, I don't want to make short videos that are about 5 or 10 minutes long, but I feel like 30 minutes is a good enough time to get a lecture in, because I don't want to do the entire series. That would take too long. So I'm just going to keep lecturing for 30 minutes, and then I'll title it the name of this lecture, whatever I think is relevant to the actual topic being discussed. Okay, so we ended in the last lecture on the importance of science. In this lecture, we're going to go over logical positivism and then logical empiricism. Logical positivism flourished for decades, but was rejected somewhere between the 1950s and the 1960s, respectively. Think historically. As a historian, I argue that people cannot actually understand who they are, why they are, and where they are physically and mentally without first having understood their own society and the societies that have came before them. For example, we cannot understand philosophy of science today without understanding first logical positivism, and we cannot understand logical positivism without understanding the classical empiricism that came before it. So classical empiricism, it means that all knowledge comes from and is justified by sense experience. It comes from 18th century British philosophy, from the British empiricist tradition, such as John Locke, Bishop George Berkeley, David Hume, and amongst others. Their empirism was a reaction to the classical rationalism of the day. Classical empiricism had precursors. You had people like Aristotle, which we've covered to some extent. We had the scholastics of the medieval ages, which we've covered in our medieval history section. And then we have Pierre Gassendi as well. Locke, however, in the 18th century, 17th century, gave his response to rationalists in the classical sense that knowledge comes from and is justified by reason, who claimed that reason could give metaphysical truths to mankind in order to reveal what the world is really like, i.e. the fundamental structures of reality. Today, rationalism means that there is confidence in the potency of human reason. This may also include confidence in metaphysical abstractions like numbers and letters and musical notes, etc. Both Plato and Descartes were excellent examples of classical rationalism. We've already covered Plato and Descartes, but both should, however, be read, well studied, and admired simply for the impact that their works still have on us today. The two central questions of empiricism is a focus on epistemology. One, how do we know? And two, which is the only acceptable claim and acceptable evidence for said claim, must refer to some sort of experience. Of course, most classical empiricists would say that knowledge is something that we can point to, repeat, and or share with others. That knowledge is something that the metaphysics of Plato and Descartes cannot reveal. Many would propose that these claims mentally and this type of mentality was the groundwork necessary for modern science to begin to develop. So it was the empiricist tradition was radical, in fact, and partial reaction to the over rationalist position of both Plato and Descartes. And the second thing about empiricism that we need to know in regards to what questions that we should ask is, what are the limits of our human knowledge? So how do we obtain knowledge, and what are the limits of that knowledge? What is the human mind? What is the mind equipped to know? Why think that the mind can grasp metaphysical truths about the nature of reality? And what are things that are possibly beyond what can be known? So we may have to start with what knowledge is, and then how it can be obtained, if indeed it can somehow be obtained. So classical empiricists would claim that the human intellect is great when analyzing experiences, but not so great at understanding the time, or the true time, but the true nature of reality. John Locke was what we might call a hard empiricist. Today, he wanted to clear the field of rubbish. He wanted to clear the field of metaphysics, the things that go beyond physics. Thus, he wanted to clear the conceptual ground of confusing ideas. This was his view of what the philosopher's role was. And according to John Locke, evidential experience came before any kind of metaphysics. He then proceeded his attack on innate ideas. Locke claimed that it is not the case that there are some ideas that all people share, and thus he attacked Plato and Descartes for thinking that some ideas are innate, or in other words, fixed into the human mind. How did Locke know this, however? After all, what was his experiential evidence to make such a claim? Locke is famous for his tabula rasa idea, or concept, that humans are born with nothing in their minds, as a blank slate, just an empty page upon which sense experience imprints ideas. We ask how the mind comes to be furnished. And Locke says, by experience. This is a very clever concept, but something that is not meant to be overlooked. I argue that obviously when one thinks, they think about things, or they think about something. Therefore, thinking has to be about something. And so Locke's tabula rasa led to a rise in notions such as sensationalism and skepticism. Do sensations pour into the mind, and then the mind absorbs them via the senses? Of course, today psychologists label sensationalism as a naive approach. But the obvious problem with a hard empiricism is that it has the potentiality to lead one towards various forms of skepticism. We cannot have to the point that we don't know that we have any knowledge at all. But in fact, we know that we do. So there are two forms. There's the external world skepticism that states that since only sensations are experienced, not the world itself, in and of itself, we can never actually have a complete true knowledge about the world that we think and that we are experiencing. And then we have inductive skepticism, which states that since we only have past and the present experiences, never the future, we cannot know if the future experiences will in turn be like the past. So the external world skepticism was made famous by the brilliant René Descartes. The mind is confined by a veil of ideas. In other words, we can never get outside of ourselves, or at least outside of our heads, in order to see the world as it really is. What are mental images and private experiences? Does the world, as it appears to me externally, is it actually the way the world is? Hence the problem with classical empiricism. Firstly, that all knowledge comes from experience, correctly perceived. We never experience the world itself, only the external sensations that seem to come from the world. And that we can never know anything about the actual world, only the world as it appears to be, or it appears to us. On this, obviously, eviscerates science, since objective nature can, and it says that objective nature cannot be known, only studied patterns in our own subjective experience. But obviously, we take a realist approach to the nature of the world, and that we can actually understand the world as it actually is. Obviously, Descartes saw the implications of empiricism, and that is why he took a rationalist route to reality. And empiricism leads to an idealism, potentially, but I say that in the world of science today, it would lead to a more of a materialistic approach. And while we can just sit around and stare at each other and seem to appear to be doing nothing but doing what we're doing, at least let's attempt to analyze and study the natural world of what seems to appear to be external experiences. Then we have the rise of logical positivism. Finally, we're getting to the fact that it was founded after World War I, after the Great War of the early 20th century, by the Vienna Circle, which was mostly German and Austrian philosophers. Ernst Mach, who'd established a metric for the speed of sound. Ernst Mach established the metric for the speed of sound. These natural philosophers were interested in scientific developments, mathematical logic, and the philosophy of language. They were interested in the works of Albert Einstein and Kurt Gödel, David Hilbert and Bertrand Russell, as well as Ludwig Wittgenstein, who wrote on science, math, logic, and language. The Vienna Circle, they did not like German idealism, so they of course stayed away from Hegel's philosophy. 19th century dominant European philosophy, particularly that of Hegel and that of Martin Heidegger. Of course, probably it did not help that Wilhelm Hegel was hard to understand, and that much of his work was obscure and perplexing, and even sometimes incomprehensible to trained Hegelian scholars. So the logical positivists thought that Hegel was worthless because he was obtuse and was not very clear in what he tried to convey. Many of Hegel's ideas are worth studying, however, and at least I think they are from a historical standpoint. Of course, it should be pointed out that Martin Heidegger was not an actual German idealist, but he was more of a phenomenologist and an existentialist, which were philosophies that came from the work of Immanuel Kant of the 18th century. The Vienna Circle, however, placed a high premium on commonsensical reason, clarity, and precision of language, while dispelling mysticism, romanticism, nationalism as a result of romanticism. Schlick, Frederick Albert Mortiz were the two founders of the Vienna Circle, and they placed an emphasis on being clear as to one's meaning when writing, and so clear as to have no room for multiple interpretations about what has been communicated. This is Frederick Albert Mortiz Schlick. He was the founder of the Vienna Circle, and he emphasized clarity. What actually distinguished logical positivism from classical empiricism was analytical synthetic distinction, which I go over in my lecture on the end part of my lecture on Ayn Rand. It's W.V.O. Quine's analytical synthetic distinction, and also the verifiability of theory of meaning. Analytical propositions, true or false in virtue of their meaning alone. With these propositions, one obviously needs to be clear in their definitions of words. This relation of ideas communicated through words, according to David Hume, is contrasted with synthetical propositions, true or false, in virtue of how the world is. Therefore, actual investigation of the world as it appears to be is necessary for knowledge. The analytical synthetic distinction allows positivists to make sense of abstract mathematical or analytical claims such as 2 + 2 = 4, where it is a truth only about the relation of ideas. Hence, by convention, the human has defined 4 as 2 + 2. The positivist believed that language was invented in order for us to communicate experiences in the abstract. In other words, the truths of mathematics and logic are not fundamental metaphysical facts, but are merely conventions that we have identified as facts as a linguistic community in order to parse, break down, and explain the experiences that we have in the external world. The verifiability of meaning. What is it? How do words get their meaning? Where do characteristic properties come from? Where do essences come from? Or what makes something what it is? The positivists rejected the Platonic realm, claiming that the meaning of a sentence is existence, and therefore how is verified. In other words, if a statement cannot be verified, it is meaningless. For the positivists, it is easy to see why they did not like Hegel. From their perspective, his metaphysical statements could not be verified as true or false because they first had to be meaningful. So this is why logical positivists think that Plato's forms and Hegel's absolute spirit have no meaning at all. So should we accept this ideology? Should we accept their denial of an external/internal world? Are statements meaningful only when they can be tested or experimented with? Is experience the only source of knowledge and meaning? The verifiability theory of meaning, when analyzed, has many problems, however, or at least is problematic in its implications. First, we must see that the positivists divided meaningful statements into two categories. First, they divided meaningful statements into observational language statements and also theoretical language statements. So how is this distinction drawn between observational language statements and theoretical language statements? they are electron microscopes actual observations, even though they are augmentations. For example, we cannot directly observe or see electrons, which are smaller than light wavelength. They are indeed smaller than nerve fibers, but we cannot feel or experience them. Another example is from Sir Roger Penrose, who did a unique study on black holes and won a Nobel Prize for it. We cannot observe black holes directly, but we do know of light, the speed of causality, that bends around the black holes. So are electrons in black holes meaningful because of observational language statements or theoretical language statements? This, the positivist had a hard time figuring out. Secondly, we must see that the positivists divided context into two categories: context of discovery and context of justification. The ideas of scientists are not always scientific, and so an example would be supersymmetry, including but not limited to different masses of selections or selectrons, neutrinos. We know stop quarks, gluons, bosons, fermions, etc. in the general model of particle physics. For example, this theory of supersymmetry is beautiful, but no evidence for it has been found. If you look at the works of Albert Einstein before his relativity theory was proven, knew that his theory of relativity was actually true before it was proven true, simply because he said, quote, "It was so beautiful, it must be true," end quote. So the logical positivists claim that legitimate science is not that which can be discovered, but those ideas that which can be verified as being the only legitimate science. The rest are not meaningful until they have been verified. Until then, they are only superstitions and speculations. As a historian, I can reconstructively say that the positivists did not care about the history of scientific discovery, nor the usefulness of philosophical thinking and the importance of imagination. Otherwise, they would not have critiqued Albert Einstein as harshly as they did. There are the problems with, however, the verifiability theory of meaning. I'm not saying that it isn't good. I'm just saying that there are problems with it. The first problem is that the majority of language is meaningless. And then secondly, poetry, ethics, theology are not verifiable, yet we still find them meaningful. And then the third thing is that the majority of language is meaningless, and that poetry, ethics, and theory are not, and theology are not verifiable. We have to ask: should they be believed? And how do we verify that the verifiability theory of meaning is the right theory of meaning? There is no verification in the verifiability theory of meaning. Therefore, the theory is meaningless in a loose sense. Their theory, including scientism, refutes itself by its own standard. Of course, we might have to start with the verifiability theory of meaning in order to have any kind of meaning at all. Willard van Orman Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism was an article that was written which said that testing and meaning are holistic, that our ideas that are tested must be every idea that is connected to the idea being tested, i.e., a hypothesis might be true if the results are false. Before a hypothesis is experimentally tested, the assumptions surrounding the test must first be tested. We have Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism. The first dogma is, as said before, the analytic-synthetic distinction. Quine argues that this distinction is not senseful or sound scientifically. He also says that analytic beliefs are not immune from testing. He says that they are also subject to multiple tests and revisions. They are also subject to falsification if there are different results. So Quine believed that humans have a web of beliefs, and that was a book that he wrote, that make contact with the world through experience. We might consider non-Euclidean geometry, or the geometry outside of Euclid's 5 postulates, and we might think of warped space. Might we consider the law of excluded middle, the dead and the not dead cat of Schrodinger? We might want to think about those examples. Next, we'll go over briefly scientific realism before we go into logical empiricism. Logical empiricism is our next subject, which I think we should just cover in the next lecture, because I think this lecture would be a good a good recap of logical positivism, kind of things that it is. We just went through a lot of really deep information, and so I think this video shouldn't be very long. We're going to end this video on logical positivism, and then in the next video we will go into logical empiricism as a step that was implemented when we recognized the fallacies of logical positivism. A brief note on scientific realism, however, is that science helps us to describe the phenomenal world or nature. Science helps us to describe nature, and logical positivism denies scientific realism because it emphasizes that science does not tell us about the fundamental structure of nature or of reality. It only our experiences in nature. So that science does not tell us about the fundamental structures that are hidden within nature, but it does tell us about our experiences in nature, and this is largely in part due to external world skepticism. So how should we avoid the drastic problems of logical positivism? This was the question that was raised in the 1950s and 60s, and we have the answer, and the answer was logical empiricism, which was made popular in the 1960s. In the next video, we will go over logical empiricism, and then we will continue on from there. Thank you for joining me in this lecture about science, and I hope that you will go back, watch a little bit, try to understand some of the points that have been made. Like I said, it was a lot of material that was covered in this lecture, and you know, a lot of material that was covered in 20 minutes time. You might have to rewatch it, or you might have to go back into it and listen to it again. I thank you for watching this lecture. Hope to see you in the next one. Until then, thank you.